Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are and how you're joining us. Thank you very much for being here today for our webinar on PFAS. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping matters to put out there while you're joining. First, you'll notice that for everybody's benefit, and because we don't want to hear flushing toilets in the background, we have muted all participant lines. If you have any questions that you would like to submit during the CLE here, you can put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them. But if we're not able to do so, we will follow up after today's CLE. As you can see, we are also recording today's event and we will circulate the recording to all registrants after the event occurs. But if you have follow-up questions, then you can reach out to us. We'll answer them, obviously not in real time. And note that if you are wanting CLE credit, you can only get the CLE credit for today's live program. The recording does not allow for CLE credit. And on the CLE credit note, you have to be on a computer or laptop for the CLE credit. It's not available for folks who are joining on mobile devices. So if you need to switch over right now from a mobile device to a laptop or computer, please do so. And one other important note, if you are looking for New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas CLE, please be sure to listen for the code word that's going to be given during this program. When you are prompted, you'll need to enter that code word into the Q&A section of the screen. And if you don't have a license in those states, don't worry about it. So here we go, now that we've gotten through all of the housekeeping items. Today, myself, Amy Rubenstein, a partner in the Denton, Chicago office, will be presenting, as well as Robin Thomerson, a partner in the Lexington office. I'll take a moment here to say that Robin just provides extraordinary counsel in the PFAS space with a truly impressive breadth and depth in navigating the challenges that clients in this space are facing. So I'm lucky to have the opportunity to be presenting with her today. And today we want to focus on why does PFAS matter to businesses? And the topics that we'll be covering are what are PFAS, where are PFAS, PFAS regulation and litigation, and finally trends and strategies for PFAS. So who has a PFAS issue? We've noticed that 1% of companies don't have a PFAS issue, 15% of companies have a PFAS issue, and there's about 84% of the world out there that has a PFAS issue and doesn't know it yet. Of course, that was just a little bit of made up for everyone's humor, but it is kind of true at this point. Companies are just starting to learn what PFAS is, how it impacts their business, and doing an investigation into whether or not they have a PFAS issue. And more often than not, there is something related to the operations, the supply chain, the distribution, et cetera, that turns out to have some manner of a PFAS component. Leading with what are PFAS, I'm going to give a very quick chemistry lesson here because I think it helps frame a lot of what Robin will be discussing later with respect to how PFAS is being regulated. So PFAS are per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. There are more than 12,000 man-made chemical compounds within this broad group. What makes PFAS kind of unique and very marketable, as they have been on the market since about the 1950s, is that they provide heat resistance, oil resistance, water resistance, grease resistance, and stain resistance. They are often called forever chemicals because they are very difficult to break the bonds and to degrade in nature. So if you look at the little atoms on the right, you can see that there are C's and F's. Those are carbon and fluorine bonds that are present in all PFAS. And then what's different about them is the head on that chain. So in the first example, that's PFOA. You can see what makes it the OA at the end, versus on the bottom, which is PFOS. You can see what makes that PFOS. And these are the two most common PFAS out there. These are the ones that people think about with respect to commercial products such as Scotchgard and Teflon, that I'm sure most folks on here are familiar with. I like to think of forever chemicals as that FC, the fluorine carbon bond is what makes it a forever chemical. Now the chemistry lesson is over. So where are PFAS found? PFAS are pretty much ubiquitous and almost found everywhere. I'm not going to sit here and read off all of the items on this slide, but just thinking about a few here for those of us who may have brushed and flossed our teeth this morning. I hope that's most of us. Dental floss. I'm looking at my nails right now, the nail polish, mascara. If you walked by a construction site this morning, I don't know what your shoes were made with today, but they likely have some manner of coating on them that contains PFAS. Moving into other industries, if you made breakfast today using a nonstick pan, chances are that nonstick pan is a PFAS product. If you were at a doctor's office, something there that you were touching involves PFAS. If you were drinking from a cup that was containing a hot beverage, probably PFAS in there to keep it heat resistant. And if you're in a room right now with a carpet or rug, that carpet or rug was probably treated with a stain or water resistant coating on it that includes PFAS. One of the largest sources of PFAS in the United States is this one on the bottom right, safety and military, used for aqueous film forming foam, a fire protection foam, as well as protective clothing in the firefighting space. And I highlight this one just to show the monetary impact of PFAS and how expensive PFAS is to clean up. Just looking at the safety and military applications for firefighting foam among, those, I don't even remember how many, 16 different tiles with at least 5 different applications. The DoD estimates that future PFAS investigation and cleanup costs will total more than $2.1 billion beginning in fiscal year 2021 alone. That's in addition to $1.1 billion that was spent in 2020. And we'll be interested in seeing what the GAO puts out next, because it was also noted that these costs will likely increase significantly and have been as current estimates are coming out. And as Robin will discuss later with respect to some of the regulations that the EPA is beginning to put in place, those are proving to be well beyond the expenses contained here. So where is PFAS found? In addition to products, where is it found in our country, in the United States? For those of you who are joining from the United States, it is pretty much everywhere. There are approximately 57,000 sites that contain PFAS. And you can see that these include military sites where things like the aqueous film forming foam, the firefighting foam, was used, as well as airports, wastewater treatment facilities, and industrial facilities. Some kind of interesting new data that has come out in 2021 and 2022 with respect to where PFAS is being found. And I put this in the context of this PFAS cycle from 2019, is household dust and background PFAS. So looking at this cycle, you can see that industry makes consumer products, AFFF, or wastewater infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants that lead to a cycle of exposures through the environment, through people, through those products, et cetera. And while that all was pretty well established by 2019, now what folks are seeing in some more recent studies that I'm mentioning in 2021 and 2022 is background PFAS, and PFAS that appears in precipitation, soil, groundwater at levels that are higher than what EPA is proposing as maximum contaminant limits for water. So you could have a water source, as was shown on the prior map, that's PFAS contaminated, that the contamination could literally be coming from rainwater or human exposure, which people previously thought could be direct from product. It could be literally from the dust in my office coming off the carpet or the electronics or other PFAS containing sources. And the amount of PFAS in dust is gaining a lot of attention because it's very hard to then trace back where the source of the PFAS was that is contained in that dust. And from a litigation perspective, which we'll discuss later, that has a large impact on causation issues. Oh, here it is, our CLE code word. So please put this in the Q&A if you would like to get CLE credit in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas. The code word is substances, plural. So just type on in substances. And I'm going to actually pop it in the chat just in case someone may have, stepped away for a second so that we can see it. I want everyone to be able to get their CLE credit for today. So substances, put it in the chat if you want your CLE credit. We'll next shift to PFAS regulation and litigation, and I'll turn the control over to Robin.
Thank you, Amy. It's also my pleasure to be presenting with Amy, who has a tremendous amount of litigation experience, especially in the PFAS area, and is a pleasure to work with, and I really appreciate her expertise. My practice focuses on environmental permitting, reporting, and compliance. So what I'm going to be talking about today is EPA's status as it regards PFAS and all of the work that they are doing on PFAS. In addition to EPA, our Denton's platform allows us the opportunity to support our international clients with expertise in Europe and around the world. And we have a team that I am using now as we speak to help represent one of my international clients who has issues in Europe. So we are very fortunate to have a very wide expertise in this area. So why is there concern about PFAS? And it's all of the things that Amy talked about earlier. Those strong carbon chains create a bond that is difficult to break. It's persistent in the environment. It bioaccumulates in fish and mammals. That means it stays in tissue and accumulates on itself, and you get higher and higher levels. It has toxicity characteristics when it goes through soil and drinking water. And so EPA has been looking at this issue for some time, and in 2021, they developed a PFAS roadmap that set out their intentions to bring to force all of their regulatory authority to combat PFAS in the environment. They are implementing that roadmap now and have started, as Amy said earlier, by addressing what is considered the premier exposure pathway, which is drinking water, and that has the largest impact on human health, it is believed. So in March 29th, to be specific, EPA proposed the first national primary drinking water standards for certain PFAS. As Amy said, PFOA and PFAS are the most common. They are also the most studied chemistry bonds that fall under the PFAS umbrella. And under these regulations, EPA would regulate PFOA and PFAS at a level of 4 parts per trillion. And they also are proposing a non-enforceable goal of 0. For some of the alternative chemistries, PFNA, PFHXS, PFBS, and GenX chemicals, these are all chemicals that once PFOA and PFOS started winding down in commerce, these alternatives started being used as they had the same properties in the desirable areas, but it was hoped that they would not have the same undesirable impacts. Now we have determined that, our EPA has determined that those are undesirable, and they are proposing in this rule that any mixture containing one or more of these chemicals would be limited under what is called a hazard index. And by hazard index, what we're talking about is a calculation of the harm that these particular constituents could cause to humans. So under this proposed rule, a water system would calculate what the hazard index is for these PFAS chemicals in their water. And if it was over a level of harm, they would have to treat the water before it is allowed to be used for human consumption. These are the first proposed national standards for PFAS constituents. The affected facilities that would be subject to these rules are public water systems, and possibly impacted are state and local agencies. And the process is such that EPA has proposed the rule. They are taking comment on the rule until May 30th, 2023. They're going to be having a listening session on May 4th, and I've given you the link there. At such time as they have responded to comments, which will be a public document, they will issue a final rule, and that is expected to be sometime this year. So in looking at this rule, we've had some initial reactions from water utilities, industry sectors, policymakers, and environmental groups. And as you might expect, differing perspectives have come up with differing responses. The American Water Works Association has estimated that over 5,000 water systems will have to install controls as a result of the rule. 2,500 water systems will have to adjust their treatment centers because they are already meeting state standards that are higher. For example, New York has a state MCL of 7 parts per trillion, and they're going to have to bump it down to 4 parts per trillion. Also, a national consultant has been employed by the American Water Works Association to estimate the cost of what this rule will impact on local communities, and their annual estimate is in excess of $3.8 billion annually, which is a large sum over and above what EPA has estimated the cost to be, which is at $1.2 billion. And of course, that is a concern because the cost is going to be borne by ratepayers and communities. Another source for the cost, which we're starting to see, and Amy will talk about later, is where local drinking water municipalities and agencies are suing sources for contribution to installing these environmental controls to make drinking water safe. EPA has said that there will be infrastructure money available, but the thought amongst industry and water utilities is that the infrastructure dollars just will not stretch far enough to cover that. Industry, in the form of the American Chemistry Council, has concerns with the science behind EPA's limits. Two of the four additional constituents that will be subject to the hazardous waste determination have not yet been studied. PFOA and PFOS, as we've said, has been studied quite extensively. The American Chemistry Council also has concerns with combining those four chemicals into one hazard index when the impacts are different from the individual constituents. Most policymakers, however, and politicians are generally positive in their response because, of course, this is a hot topic item right now in the media and in other sources, both here and in Europe. Environmental groups are generally positive. However, they are not happy with the rate at which EPA is moving and would like to see EPA moving faster. As I've said down here, stakeholders have requested a 30-day comment period extension. And one of the reasons is the complexity of the rule. Just to give you a point of reference, 1 part per trillion is equivalent to a single drop of water from an eyedropper in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. At this level, as you might imagine, it is very, very difficult to detect with the current technology that we have. And actually, EPA set the limit and stated that it is at 4 parts per trillion because that is currently the lowest detection limit available from a technology perspective and from a scientific perspective. So what you, in essence, have is not only a goal of 0, but it is, the enforceable limit is so low, it is in essence 0. To give you an idea of the complexity of the rule and the need for additional time to comment, EPA posed 59 separate questions from a technical perspective that they asked the public to comment upon those 59 questions. There are over 3,000 pages of technical data for review, and there are very, very complex statistical analysis involved in the rule that we've had a request from various sectors, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, industry sectors, and water agencies that have said in order to give adequate response and comment on this rule, an additional 30 to 60 days is going to be necessary. And we have not yet heard from EPA whether or not that comment period will be extended. Just to say they have typically in recent days not been extending comment periods or extending them for very short periods of time, such as 15 days. As I said before, EPA is using a multi-authority approach in dealing with PFAS. They have said they are going to use all of their authority, including the Safe Drinking Water Act, under which they've proposed the MCLs. They are going to use CERCLA, which is a national superfund. And they proposed in September of last year to add PFOS and PFOA as designated hazardous substances under CERCLA. That designation had been targeted to be finalized by the end of the year, but they have received significant pushback. We're going to talk about some of those reasons in just a moment. EPA had put this rule out or this proposal out as being a reporting rule, but that is not all that CERCLA is. If you know anything about Superfund law, you know that it is a very broad law that has very significant impacts and very little maneuvering room for compliance. It is a law of strict liability that is broad-based and casts a wide net and brings in a large number of people. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. In January of this year, EPA put out a request for comment on adding PFAS constituents to its national enforcement and compliance initiatives. It would allow EPA to look at PFAS sites as regarding enforcement priority for those sites. They say that they want to assist states in cleaning up PFAS and going against responsible parties and making it a priority for enforcement years 24 through 27. They have received, not surprisingly, a good bit of pushback on that. It would target manufacturers releasing PFAS, which could be manufacturers who right now don't know that they have a problem. Industry does not want PFAS looked at in this way as a total PFAS problem because there are so many individual constituents and not all are the same. They've also pushed back saying that there are not meaningful standards yet. So without standards, it should not be an enforcement priority. Utilities are saying that it is premature because they are passive receivers, water utilities, wastewater utilities, and states have pushed back somewhat, saying that putting it on the enforcement initiative could cause there to be problems with state-led sites. In 2023, we are expecting EPA to also bring to bear the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is we call that RCRA, which covers hazardous wastes. And EPA has recently said they expect to get a proposed rule out in June, designating PFOA and PFOS as hazardous waste. RCRA is what is called a cradle to grave rule, so that if you generate hazardous waste, you have to report on it, you have to manifest the waste, and then it has to go to a proper hazardous waste storage, treatment, or disposal facility. And then if those storage, treatment, and disposal facilities have releases, then they have to clean up under RCRA remediation guidelines. EPA has said that they are not going to treat PFAS as a cradle to grave issue. They are just going to treat it for remediation purposes, but we will see what the rule looks like when it comes out in June. I want to go back to the CERCLA designation. As I said, CERCLA has very broad coverage. When promulgating rules, EPA is not allowed to consider costs, whereas the cost for a CERCLA designation is very high. Reporting is required, but you also have cleanup, cost recovery. It is a strict liability statute. So if you contributed to waste that is considered hazardous substances and is a Superfund site, then the contributor is a potentially responsible party, just like the owner and the operator. There's been a great deal of pushback on this from what I previously termed as passive receivers. Those are wastewater treatment plants, water plants that have discharge from their drinking water or from wastewater. And EPA has said that for those particular facilities, it will apply enforcement discretion where they have passively received PFAS as a contaminant from other sources, where it's just gone through their drinking water system or gone through their wastewater system. One thing that is very common for wastewater treatment systems to do is they will take biosolids from their wastewater treatment plant, which is basically the sludge that comes off a wastewater treatment plant. That has historically been utilized as a beneficial, what's called a beneficial reuse, in that it is very good fertilizer. It has been used on farms as a fertilizer for many, many years. if you have a designated hazardous substance in the fertilizer you put on your farm, then you're going to have reporting and potentially cleanup responsibilities on your farm, as well as from the wastewater treatment plant. The utilities are asking Congress and EPA for an exemption for this type of passive receipt of PFAS, but that has not happened as of yet, and EPA is working on enforcement guidance. But as you might imagine, under a broad strict liability statute, utilities are concerned that that will not be enough, and they are asking specifically for an exemption. A major unanswered question for those of us in the environmental world and in the remediation world is, once you are cleaning up PFAS contaminated soils, groundwater, and other media, what are you going to be able to do with it? If it is a hazardous substance, landfills are not going to be able to accept it. Otherwise, they'll be accepting hazardous substances and subjecting themselves to possible liability under CERCLA. What is going to happen to that? The ultimate destruction of PFAS is incineration. That particular method has its own set of problems and own set of controversies. Is that a safe mechanism for destroying PFAS? And then also incineration facilities are not plentiful. And we are now seeing estimates for disposal of PFAS contaminated waste in upwards of the $900 to $1,000 per ton arena, which makes the cost absolutely phenomenal, and will not be possible for many people who may be subject to this rule. As of the 13th of April, EPA has published a request for comment on adding 9 additional PFAS constituents to the list of hazardous substances. We also want to talk briefly about modification of reporting requirements. If your facility is subject to TRI, toxic release inventory reporting requirements, they are going to strengthen that rule, or they propose to strengthen that rule to allow no de minimis exemptions for PFAS, ranges, simplified reporting, or more work. This will, of course, be more work for suppliers and people who are required to report. EPA has also sent to the Office of Management and Budget for pre-release review an air toxic emissions reporting requirement that could potentially increase the number of items that have to be reported, including fires and possibly PFAS related emissions. For those of you in consumer products, the FDA has been petitioned to ban PFAS in certain products, especially fast food packaging. And then they are also lobbying for additional regulation for other items under FDA control, such as cosmetics and other consumer type items. Needless to say, there's a lot of litigation that's going to go around these rules. Initially, the American Chemical Council challenged EPA's health advisory that preceded the MCLs. That action was dismissed for standing purposes. Kimura's company has also challenged the interim health advisories for Gen-X contaminants. That case is still alive and is pending. In other cases, states have sued large chemical companies for pollution of their waters. My state, Kentucky, just recently in the last 2 weeks, sued DuPont, Chemours, and Corteva for contamination of the Ohio River related to its West Virginia plant. They've asked for remediation costs, natural resources damages, and then they are also asking for damages under the Kentucky Avoidable Transactions Act because DuPont divested certain of its liabilities to subsidiary companies like Chemours and Corteva. With that, I am going to turn it over to Amy again.
Thank you, Robin. As Robin was mentioning, there are a lot of federal regulatory things happening both on the EPA side and the FDA. But something that's also of note is that states are also enacting or proposing PFAS regulations on consumer products. And although, in terms of geographic landscape, this doesn't look like a lot of states have done it. This is actually more than half of the states in the United States have either enacted or proposed PFAS regulations. Some that are notable that we've seen impact our clients already are New York and California's bans on PFAS in food containers. So if you're a company that either makes a food product that is sold in New York or California, or you manufacture packaging for products that end up in New York and California, as of right now, those packages need to be PFAS free. I can imagine plaintiffs' counsels walking into Whole Foods in any of those states, buying every single product on the market that has any sort of grease in it, and testing it to make sure that it's PFAS free. So take this as a warning to be careful. Next up are a lot of garment related PFAS restrictions also going to hit in California or New York. Clothing that contains PFAS, think about like companies that make outdoor clothing or athletic gear, even a ton of children's clothing, anything with that stain resistant, moisture wicking, fast drying type of technology. Those fabrics have been treated in some way that makes it have that property, and usually that way is PFAS. So if you are in one of those industries, you're kind of next on the line for state regulations. And of course, what ends up happening when you've got one state that's making this regulation and you are a manufacturer that sells nationwide or even worldwide, you end up wanting to meet whatever that standard is so that you don't have different manufacturing lines. Maine, for example, has pretty much banned all PFAS in consumer products beginning in 2030. There are, of course, some exceptions and some grandfathering, but that's one to look out for. And other states are thinking of doing the same. And what we're realizing is that often our clients don't even realize that, like I said, going back to that first slide, that was kind of a joke, you don't realize you have a PFAS problem. One example was a food manufacturer from Australia that was importing into the US, including New York and California. And, 30 days before the bans went into effect, kind of calling us in a tizzy saying, hey, my US distributor said that I can't sell in the US now because my packaging contains PFAS. And we're like, well, they're right. So trying to switch that stuff over can be very challenging on a rushed basis and figuring out alternative sources. So just be aware that even if you don't think you have a PFAS problem right now, somewhere in your supply chain, you actually might. These regulations, as well as upcoming regulations, are certainly going to increase litigation in the PFAS context. And already courts are looking at this as an existential threat to business that is being created by PFAS litigation. One federal judge who's overseeing a multi-district litigation in South Carolina Judge Gergel is overseeing about 3,000 cases in an MDL related to the firefighting foams. And he's quoted as saying, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if certain motions don't go the defense's way, the defendants are in an existential threat to their survival. And that's true. You can see the huge uptick in litigation happening. There was a wave in 2015. There's a new wave now that's occurring. And many companies are actually deciding to exit the market. So 3M exited the PFOS, the PFOS market, effective 2002, so literally 21 years ago, and this litigation is still continuing. And 3M has come out and also said that they're going to exit the PFAS market entirely by 2025. That doesn't protect from historic litigation. And just a side note for many companies out there and many insurance carriers out there who are dealing with this, some of these liabilities date back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So companies are not only facing the actions direct from plaintiffs, like people saying that they were injured by PFAS, municipal water districts and water providers saying that now they have to clean up contamination resulting from PFAS, or communities seeking medical monitoring just in case they later become ill from PFAS. But those companies that are being sued are also seeking insurance coverage where possible. And the challenge of pulling up policies that, like I said, might go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and new policies and the different wording of those policies, whereas some older policies might have exclusions, some newer policies might have exclusions, some older policies do not. Figuring out the morass of who ultimately pays for this litigation and the cleanup costs is something that is going to go on forever as well. This is not unlike asbestos. There will be a body of law that gets created in terms of causation, in terms of insurance coverage, and we're right now seeing that all start to shake out. So the law is very much unsettled in this area from a liability perspective, as well as from an insurance coverage perspective. And both of these things are going to play out in the courts, state by state, over the coming decades, and have some inconsistent rulings. So intellectually, this is going to be a challenging area to navigate. So looking at those challenges, we'd like to discuss some of the trends and strategies to deal with them. And part of that is understanding what's happening right now. Where is the litigation landscape that we're seeing? First, personal care products are being targeted for litigation. So things such as like, hey, there's PFAS in my shampoo, or there's PFAS in the container for my shampoo. There's PFAS in my cosmetics. There was a big hubbub about a year ago where some lab conducted testing on like hundreds of different cosmetic products and came out and published the results. And that turned into kind of like a mass hysteria over, oh my goodness, there's PFAS in the mascara that I'm putting on my eyes and the lipstick on my lips, down to like right now, there's a lawsuit involving Tampax tampons and other menstrual products for containing PFAS. CoverGirl, L'Oreal, they've all been sued and will continue to be sued as more and more people take note of the potential concerns with these products, which really, we can debate for hours, but I will just say that the causal link between PFAS and any of the maladies that people are saying PFAS causes is very tenuous, and there's a lot of scare going on out there. And that scare certainly drives lawsuits. And when I started this discussion, noting that we're all touching things that contain PFAS, it's a very much a reptilian theory going on here, and it would be very hard to find a jury that is not sensitized to the fact that as these products are being discussed, that every single member of the jury has also come into contact with these products and is thinking about themselves and their families. Moving across to building and household materials, we've talked about carpets and textiles. The carpet industry in Georgia has settled many, many lawsuits involving their products and the stain-resistant chemistry in PFAS that's been used on those products. The Chattahoochee River in Georgia, which kind of flows from the Dalton area, which is the carpet capital of the US, is known to be one of the most contaminated sites in the US. I expect that those building and household materials and the contamination of those waterways will lead to the Georgia communities also bringing lawsuits like Robin mentioned in Kentucky for water contamination. Of course, industrial sites that make anything along the chain. So it's not just the PFAS itself, it's potentially the telomeres, the fluorotelomere alcohols that go into a PFAS that create that chemistry. So like the component parts and the sites where those component parts are made can become contaminated, neighboring properties, upstream, downstream, shared sites that end up having an issue. And then secondary, if this site is closed down and we want to use the land for something else, this gets into the CERCLA and the RCRA sites that once were industry that now are no longer being used. As I mentioned on the last slide, fire protection is a huge source of alleged PFAS contamination, and the water contamination from doing testing drills and protection from actual fires, where the chemistry to contain a fuel fire like you would see at an airport or a military site contains PFAS. And to this day, the Department of Defense does not have a better material to contain one of those huge petrochemical or fuel fires that can occur in a military or an aviation setting. And each year, the Department of Defense, while simultaneously saying like, you have to have PFAS in a fire protection material to be part of a qualified product for military use, EPA is saying you can't use this stuff anymore. And so there's this conflict, but what definitely is going on is that there are over 3,000 lawsuits currently sitting in a multi-district litigation involving contamination alleged to be from these fire protection sources. And the first of those lawsuits, one of the bellwether trials, is going to happen in June. And that will really show kind of the world what is going to happen. It's considered a bellwether trial. And for that reason, we will be watching to see how these trials can play out. The last one here is food packaging, which also is the subject of significant litigation. McDonald's, Burger King, Chipotle, anything that has kind of that grease or heat resistance in its packaging likely contains or contained PFAS. And there's the claim that it leaches into the food, and then by eating it, people are consuming the PFAS that way. Those lawsuits are ongoing. They're, class actions and mass actions, and it's yet to be seen where those land, because how do you quantify the amount of PFAS that you've consumed over a lifetime from food packaging? So there are certainly challenges. There is an unsettled landscape for these cases, but we expect that there will be more and more litigation going on in this space, as well as on the transactional side, more and more due diligence in M&A and divestitures and acquisitions, where people are asking questions about what's your company's PFAS portfolio. So even if you have zero risk from a litigation perspective or think that you do, it might be worth doing a risk assessment or analysis if you're thinking about engaging in a transaction, if you're thinking about selling part of your company, buying another company. At this point in time, if you are buying a company and that makes anything or owns any property, and you're not asking a question about PFAS risk, you're not conducting a thorough due diligence analysis. And we can see this in the litigation space, that companies that were bought or sold 20 or 30 years ago, the purchasers of these companies are now dealing with a legacy PFAS issue that they didn't know to ask about 20 or 30 years ago when they were buying that company, and they've now inherited that risk. But at this point, if you're not asking a question about PFAS in any sort of buy or sell transaction, kind of shame on you for not doing your homework at this point. So what are some protective strategies that companies can engage in to try to manage or mitigate the PFAS risk? First, conducting a baseline study in terms of what is the PFAS risk that's affecting your business. Are you making PFAS? Are you inadvertently, through your processes, creating PFAS? One client that I was working with believed that it did not have any PFAS in its raw materials, but through their processing, PFAS was actually being created. So even if you aren't starting with PFAS, and even if you don't think you're making something with PFAS in your manufacturing, you could end up inadvertently making PFAS. So doing those baseline studies to see, are we doing something making PFAS and we might not even know it? Check your supply chain. Do an analysis of whether your raw materials that are coming in the door contain PFAS. Is your manufacturing process, as I just mentioned, creating PFAS? Do your products, even if you think, we're not getting anything that contains PFAS, our manufacturing is not creating any PFAS, but do your products degrade into PFAS? And there are some chemicals that do end up degrading into PFAS. We call those kind of a shapeshifter. They never started as PFAS, but somehow, when they're sitting in a landfill with other chemicals, they create those carbon fluorine bonds that lead to a PFAS. So know what you're dealing with. If there is a possibility that you might be getting or sending PFAS out from what you're doing, think about some sort of an indemnity agreement. Think about that indemnity agreement not only in the context of supply and distribution agreements, but also when you are engaging in a transaction and dealing with legacy liabilities, putting yourself in the best position to be indemnified. And of course, now that everyone's hearing this, this is nothing like magic, but everyone's going to be asking for the same thing. So really negotiating that to the extent possible to best protect yourself from those historical liabilities, to protect yourself from future liabilities through an indemnity procedure. Look at your corporate structure. Certainly, DuPont, Chemours, Corteva, as Robin alluded to earlier, have engaged in various transactions to spread or offset their PFAS liability. Certainly other folks on this CLE might debate with me whether that's successful or unsuccessful. Johnson & Johnson has also done similar things with respect to talc liabilities. So if through your baseline study or your supply chain analysis, you realize that you do have a PFAS problem that isn't kind of out there in the world, this could be the time to think about some restructuring or creative insolvency angles that you might want to deploy in a way to avoid fraudulent transfer, but to mitigate your risk going forward. And then, of course, insurance and reinsurance offsets the risk in many ways for this, or can, and looking at what a well-functioning insurance and reinsurance portfolio has, as well as from the insurance and the reinsurance perspective, looking as an insurer reinsurer. What are your risks here? Who are you insuring and reinsuring? What do your policies look like? At what point in time did you stop writing risks that would cover PFAS? When did your forms change? And, for an insurance carrier, thinking about what your reinsurance might look like for different time periods. So there's lots of ways to engage in protective strategies here and to think about this. And of course, Robin or I or any number of our colleagues in the US and worldwide can help think about these issues with you, because they're big issues and they're challenging to deal with. I think that's all we have for today. We put the infinity symbol here, kind of tongue in cheek, because PFAS is the forever chemical that's going to go on and on. We both want to thank you for participating in today's CLE. As some kind of closing housekeeping items, in about 30 business days, you'll receive an email with a link to your CLE certificate. Your webinar login and details are used to process these certificates. No additional steps are required by you. The code word requirement, substances, which I put in the chat earlier, is only required for Kansas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And if you have any questions, there are 2 more minutes that we have for you. If anyone wants to pop something into the chat, or if our team saw anything come through on the Q&A that we can answer quickly, Robin and I would be happy to do so, or feel free to send stuff to us. After this, you have our contact information. No questions? Certainly can't be that Robin and I covered everything, because in an hour, it was quite a slice to give a lit and regulatory overview in that period.
It was a sprint.
I'm seeing right here a quick question. If PFAS are so ubiquitous, how are plaintiffs showing causation? How can a municipal water utility protect itself and assure PFAS-free water meeting the standards? What are the medical consequences of PFAS absorption in the body? So I will start with the first question. If PFAS are so ubiquitous, how are plaintiffs showing causation? They are trying to show that a particular PFAS chemistry can be attributed to a particular company. So for example, PFOS was 99% created by 3M. So if you're dealing with PFOS, more likely than not, that came from 3M. For PFOA, they are looking for different chemical fingerprints, like, was this PFOA produced by telomerization or electrochemical fluorination? How was the fluorine bonded? And different companies use different ways. There are many different chemists that are studying it, but it's hard. And I mean, I know that sounds really whiny, like it's hard, but it really is, from a causal perspective, to show whether someone's PFAS, PFOA, or overall PFAS came from a certain source. And they're doing things like traditional plaintiffs' identification mechanisms, like, hey, in a fire department or at a military site, did you see that you had, 3M's light water or a different product that was on site? So it's both of those things are being done. Can someone identify through purchase records, through seeing something on site, the PFAS chemistry that was there, or can you do an analysis of the soil, groundwater, et cetera, to show where it came from. The second question, how can a municipal water utility protect itself and assure PFAS-free water meeting the standards? Municipal water districts are going to have to engage in testing, essentially, as Robin mentioned, to a 0 parts per trillion PFAS standard. The way that a water utility can protect itself is by now going forward, testing, engaging in remediation efforts. There are many different kinds of remediation that are publicly available, whether you're using reverse osmosis, granular activated charcoal filters, also known as GAC filters. There's other technology that heats, as Robin mentioned, the PFAS to destroy the atoms. That's successful in both water and sludge or biosolids. So a municipal water district should be engaging in testing and remediation. And the last question, the medical consequences of PFAS absorption in the body. This is one that's really kind of a trick bag. You know, toxicologists will tell you, depending on which side they're looking at, that there's no causal medical consequence of PFAS absorption in the body. Other folks will tell you that it can cause cancer and reproductive issues and a whole host of maladies. So there's really a lot of conflict even within the medical community as to what are the consequences, if any, of PFAS absorption in the body. I went through that really quickly. Robin, I don't know if you want to jump in and add on any of those answers that I gave.
Most of our municipal water utilities here are aware of what their PFAS liability is, what their levels are, and testing is the key. Knowing what you're dealing with is the key, and whether or not you're over or under and how much. And there are technologies out there, and I would expect there will be some guidance coming from EPA on compliance in the near future. And what Amy was saying, the conflict on causation is part and parcel of what has been an industry complaint about how EPA is moving forward, because the complaint is that there's not enough study to warrant these overly conservative numbers that EPA has produced, and that there is a lot of conflict out there on what is the result of human consumption and what is actually tied to PFAS exposure. So that is an up and coming area. The studies are not definitive as they have been in the past when we had known cancer risks. You know, EPA is still engaging in what may or may not be a health issue.
I'm told that we are out of time now, and I know that some other people put questions in the Q&A. We will get those questions. Robin and I will work on answering them. We really appreciate you joining us today, and we hope that this was a useful CLE for your business.
Thank you.
Thank you.